and so that they can take their land from them, and because that's what they do. And there's lots of discussion about those battles and how they're winning them, and how God delivers these peoples into their hand. And they live, essentially, Joshua then meets out the various parts of the land to the different tribes, and they live as a tribal, what's described as a tribal confederacy in one of the books we read. And that goes on for that, his leadership, the leadership of the judges, goes on to the point in which the Jewish people decide they want to have kings instead of a king, instead of just any old leader. And that's not our part. That'll be told in the United Monarchy part. But this is, that's, let's see, Joshua ends with the clans. They reaffirm the covenant. There's discussion of that. There are a lot of interesting stories in this part of it, not the least of which is the Battle of Jericho. We all know where they march around Jericho 7 times, and the walls, blow the horn, and walls fall down. Let's see. Yeah, this is the first, at least according I think it was your book, the first time where Jerusalem is mentioned, actually, is here, which is interesting. And I think, and this is where there's an introduction of Bethlehem as well. It's going to be an important, obviously, to us at some point. I think that's all right.
Yep, thank you. Good job. So, yeah, Jerusalem is not mentioned in the Pentateuch, which is a fascinating thing to think about, given how important it is for Christians and Jews. So this time period then begins with the death of Moses. Joshua 1:1 literally says, after the time of the death of Moses, Joshua, right? And it's going to conclude with, at the end of Judges, 2 times, I think, maybe 3, it says, there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Wink, wink, right? Which is not a good thing for people to be doing, right? And so, again, we get set up in the book of Judges for what's going to happen next, right? We're already looking ahead to this kingship idea, right? So all the other nations have got a king. And Judges, this kind of judging leadership, which is basically a sort of temporary, ad hoc, kind of charismatic leader, is filled with the Spirit, comes in, delivers Israel, there's peace again, right? And then they go for 20 years or 10 years or 40 years, and then they find themselves being oppressed by another group, and another charismatic leader raises up. The most famous is Deborah, and probably in Gideon and Samson, right? These really great stories from the books of Judges. Okay, that brings us to United Monarchy.
Okay, so then, as was said before, so now this is time of the kings, and we have some important names, and this is from Samuel, 1 Kings, not all of it, certain chapters, 1 Chronicles and 2 Chronicles and Psalms. So some of the important names that we found was Samuel, Saul, King David, Solomon, Nathan the prophet, Goliath, Bathsheba. Skipping through to get it in the 2 minutes. You have a lot of war, a lot of battles. This is a lot of time of strife. This is when David named the capital city Jerusalem. We have the Ark. You have the temple that was trying to be built under Solomon. You have this period of the Golden Age that's happening in Israel. A lot of murders and killing, competition to take the throne. This concept of Solomon's wisdom that's taking place in here. You have the treaties and the process of the temple being built. Yeah, I mean, more about King David and his many wives. I mean, there's just a lot going on, but this is just kind of summarize it to keep it condensed into 2 minutes.
So 3 kings in the United Monarchy. United Monarchy means that we have one kingdom, right? It's a bit of a mess, but they're together. And Saul, David, Solomon, right? Saul's the tragic figure that kind of from the very beginning, we just kind of know it's not going to work out. In fact, while he's the king, God anoints David to be the king, right? And there's this weird kind of moment, it's like, well, we already have a king, right? Saul's the king. And so David, obviously, Jerusalem, the most important thing to know about David is the genius move to move the capital to Jerusalem, which had been a Jebusite city. And then Solomon's big feat is to build the first temple, right? So those are the three big kings during that time period. Good, thank you. Divided monarchy. Yes. Middle finger.
I got hung up on the group. Okay. This is a lot of books. And it goes from 922 to 587. So we kind of went back from 78 years to more. That's why it took us longer. Anyway, we go all the way from 2 Kings all the way through to Zephaniah. This is, from what I can see, this is like the main huge portion of the Old Testament where you learn, in my opinion, why we could trust Jesus or God or the Holy Spirit or whatever you attribute to the Old Testament. This is why we can believe in the Lord, because of all that, what happens here. Solomon's king, David dies, there's Elijah and Elisha. David, we get the first census. There's a reform of religion by Hezekiah. Jeremiah has the prophecy. He gets the call of prophecy. They get called to return to God, to follow God. Israel did not want to turn to God after their affliction. Jonah gets sucked up in a whale, which was not, it's not like a shark, it's not a vacuum, it's a big fish. They are promised peace and restoration for Zion in the future. God empties or pours out his wrath on their enemies, and then it's said that he will sweep away Judah. Judah? Is that right? Sorry. So, for me, that's the fun, right? Because that is like a story to me. There's all these characters that look alike, and you have to try to remember their names.
Yeah.
That's all.
Excellent. So, divided monarchy is called that because now we have two kingdoms. The kingdom in the north is the kingdom of Israel. The kingdom in the south is the kingdom of Judah. We often think of those kingdoms as kind of running side by side, and they do for a little while, but the northern kingdom falls first in 722, and so it doesn't last as long. It only lasts about 200 years. And then the southern kingdom, continues on until the exile. So how does this poster divided monarchy start? It starts with the death of Solomon and the fact that his two sons fight over who's going to be the next king. Jeroboam and Rehoboam, and they can't figure out who's going to, this has always been an issue of who's next in line, right? Solomon is not David's firstborn, right? Solomon is the one that Bathsheba on David's deathbed says, this is my son, and, right? And he becomes the king, and then Solomon has multiple children, multiple sons, and so they fight over it and they split it, and that's the reason why you get a divided kingdom. And the end of that poster happens in 587 when the Babylonians come into town in Jerusalem and wipe them out. Before that happens, the northern kingdom is destroyed in 722 by the Assyrian Empire. So, another way to tell this story is to think about which empire is large and in charge through each of these posters, because there is almost always a big empire. Israel is not a big empire. It's always a tiny little kind of backwater place that's stuck between Egypt and Mesopotamia, which is the only reason why anyone ever cares about it. It's because it's stuck between these two big empires, and so they just keep meeting in the middle to fight over the land, right? So if we think back here, we can think back to some of the empires that were in charge, right? For example, Egypt features prominently here as the kind of big empire that's in charge during this time. During the Judges' time period, we get a series of oppressors. Philistines, for example, come to mind, right? As a big empire that oppresses them. during the time of the United Monarchy, David's fighting off all sorts of folks. He's fighting the Philistines, but he's also got Egypt is still a possibility. During the divided monarchy, we have Egypt and Assyria both prominently fighting each other, and it's always the king of Israel or Judah is always trying to decide whether to be an ally of Egypt or to be an ally of Assyria. And if they get that wrong, they're going to go down. That's exactly what happens. In 722, Assyria comes in and destroys the northern kingdom. Samaria is the capital in Israel, destroys it. The Judah hangs on for a while, another 150 years or so, until finally the Babylonians, who have not been in the scene really, right? They're a whole new empire. They're super ancient, but they have kind of been, Babylon is like far away, right? So you have to really have your kind of like imperial agenda to go all the way from Babylon down into this area. But they finally do it, and they conquer the Assyrians, which means they conquer this area and take it over. And that leads to the last poster that's at least down the window, the Babylonian exile.
All right. Well, in the Babylonian exile, the southern kingdom of Judah has been taken over by the Babylonians. And the books that we had were Lamentations, Ezekiel, and a section of Daniel, not the one that has the lion's den. And in Lamentations, there really aren't people as individual characters, but you have a cry to God. So God, of course, is one of the important people in that. But you also have Jerusalem personified and Judah personified in the writings of this very lyrical and very sad portion. Some of the other events in there, there's no temple, there's no monarchy because they've all been taken over. And so there's an oppressive sadness. Ezekiel has visions. He eats a scroll. He sees a wheel. We sing songs about it. There are a lot of songs about this era that come out of this section of the Bible. If you think about it, there's, Ezekiel saw a wheel rolling. There's dry bones. There's, what's another one? What was it? I don't know. Oh, by the waters of Babylon, we sat down and wept. Okay, so that's it. You've got the fiery furnace. Then when we get to Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, we also have the fourth person who was also in the fire. Daniel sees visions. Daniel interprets dreams. And so there are places that are in there are Tyre, Babylon, Israel, Egypt, Jerusalem.
Great, thank you. So, to summarize the Babylonian exile, I would say it's a loss of temple, it's a loss of land, it's a loss of kingship. And those three things are the theological foundations of the nation. Right? This temple that Solomon built and that God blessed and God wanted to happen, right, is now gone. The land that was promised back here, right, and that they had to wander around to get to and eventually did get in the promised land is now gone. And they've lost kingship, which was started back here with Saul and David, and God says to David, I will, make an everlasting covenant with you. And that's gone. So the three pillars of their tradition are now wiped away. It's a theological crisis, which is why you get such poignant language in Lamentations about how the mighty city has fallen. It's the reason why it's so sorrowful and such a terrible moment and that's the reason why I think Ezekiel is so bizarre, is because it's a theological crisis. They're kind of trying to figure out how to rebuild their understanding of God. Because if they lost the temple, then does that mean that there's another God that's mightier than their God? And if they lost the land, does that mean that there's another people group that has a better land, that's stronger, right? If they lost their kingship, right, does that mean there's another kingship somewhere else that they should be worshiping or, or listening to or obeying? So it's a theological crisis there during the Babylonian exile. And then finally, the Persian period, sorry, it's on the chair, 539 to 332, is when the Persian Empire comes in, right? And when they come in and conquer the area, they allow the Jews that are in exile to come back to Israel, come back to the land, rebuild the temple. So we get the second temple built during this time period. The second temple that will stay, that will be around when Jesus is alive and walking and comes to Jerusalem. It's that temple. Rebuilt in the post-exilic Persian period. So they rebuild the temple and they return back from exile. And then after that, there are two more empires, the Greeks and the Romans, right, which get us up to the New Testament, right? The Roman Empire is in charge by the time we get around to tiny Jesus. Okay, if there were 5 dates that I would like for you to memorize, these would be the 5. And come to think of it, this would be an excellent, exam question. If you were to take some kind of exam at some point.
They will.
But this would be a really good exam question to tell me about what happened on these 5 dates. So let's work together on that. Okay? 5 dates. 12:25. Yeah, this is the Exodus event. This is one. The farther back you go, the less certain we are about nailing down a specific date, right? You have to give us 100 years or so, because we're dealing with ancient time. But this is one date that's been proposed. 12:25 as the Exodus. I've lost all my markers. Borrow one.
Here's one.
What happens in 1,000? Any guesses? Yeah, this is basically that transition from judges to kings. And so this is kind of Saul David, right? So this is this transition to a kingship. It happens around 1,000. So I picked 1,000 because that's easy to remember, right? It may have been, might have been 990. Might have been 970, right? So 1,000 really is really the moment where we transition to a kingship. Israel wants a king, gets a king. 922. This is the division of the united monarchy into two. The northern kingdom being Israel, southern kingdom being Judah. In the alphabet H-I-J. Right, so A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J. So Israel, Judah, Israel, Judah, Israel, Judah, Israel, Judah, Israel, Judah. Israelites are in the north, Judahites or Judeans are in the south. The division.
Is this exam in the older book?
Yes.
722. Syrians. Yeah, I've got to get them in there first. The Assyrians come in and conquer Israel, the northern kingdom. 722. And then 587 is when the Babylonians come in and conquer Judah. I think with those dates, you can usually ground yourself kind of in the narrative of what's happening when. So that when you read a story about Elijah, you kind of know where you are and what poster you're on, right? If that's helpful to think about. Maybe you'll just always think of me and think of what poster is this story on, right? So Ahaz, right? King Ahaz, or King Josiah, or King Hezekiah. All of those are kings during the divided monarchy, right? When there are two different kingdoms. So we got to ask, are they a king of Israel or are they king of Judah? And this is where it gets super confusing and where they like have the same name. Because that happens, right? People are named Mark. More than one person is named Mark and John, right? And Tyler. So back then, people had more than one name, and they ended up actually having kings that had the same name. One of them was the king of Israel, one of them was the king of Judah, and they reigned at different times. And so it's confusing to figure out who's who. But at least it puts you in this time period thinking about what was going on during that time period. Okay, questions, comments? Absolutely. Okay, 2 minutes. So I have one more thing, and then we're gone, and then we're out. Okay. So this is the chronology according to the books themselves as they present the history. What I want to plant in your mind for you to think about and come back tomorrow and have us think some more about is not all of the books of the Bible were written during the time that they are relaying the events that they write about. So, Genesis talks about the time period 2000 to 1500, but most scholars think Genesis was not written during 2000 to 1500. Does that make sense as a distinction? There's a distinction between the time period that the book is talking about and when that book was written. It's as simple as the distinction between I can write a book, well, I couldn't do it. Someone could write a book about the Civil War. They would be talking about the 1860s, but they would be writing that book in 2022. Do you think the fact that they're writing it in 2022 might affect the way they talk about 1860s? Yeah, right? So this is what we call critical biblical scholarship. And this is what is sometimes people say, don't go to seminary, you'll lose your faith. This is the scary kind of monster in the room for many people, is that many of us grew up kind of thinking, just kind of intuitively, well, Joshua must have been taking notes, and right, so he must have written during this time period, right, 1200 to 1000. But what if Joshua was actually written in fact, what if all of those books, let's just take that whole chunk and say, what if they're written kind of down here, right? What's going to happen is the fact that they're written down here is going to affect how they talk about way back then. It doesn't mean that there's not a strong oral tradition running through, right? They're passing it down because that's literally one of the commandments in the book of, right, in the Torah. Tell it to your children and your children's children. Right? Keep the story going. But it does mean that at some point down here, as we get to this side, we have more evidence for the writings actually happening. How the scroll move through the Exodus? Right? I mean, they walk across on dry land, but I'm keeping the scrolls up here, right, as I'm walking across in case it gets watery, right? So we don't have a lot of evidence for writing happening during this time period of these books. We have a lot of evidence that it's happening on later down. And then scholars are, of course, going to just argue like crazy as to when it actually was, right? But the distinction I want you to kind of work with is when you're looking at a biblical book is when is it purporting to, what's it purporting to talk about? When's it saying that it happened? And separate that from when it was actually written. What time period is it talking about? And that's different from when it was written down. So that's why when you read some of these books, either that I signed or just any of the books sometimes, they will talk about, I'll take Ruth very quickly as an example, right? Do I want to take Ruth as an example? Yeah, I do. Okay, so Ruth is a story about a Moabite woman, right? And the way the story ends is, and she's the great mother of David, right? And the way the story begins is, actually Ruth begins with, during the time when the judges were judging. So in verse 1 of Ruth, chapter 1, verse 1, it literally tells you when it wants to set the story. And it wants to say, I'm going to tell you a story about when the judges were around. Does that mean it was written when the judges were around? No, because I can say, I'm going to tell you a story about the Revolutionary War. I'm going to tell you a story about the French Revolution, right? So many scholars think because it is about Moabites and letting them be a part of the community, which is kind of scandalous, right? That this book of Ruth is probably written maybe even after the exile, maybe even Persian period. Because after the exile, we know that that was a hot button controversial topic for the people coming back was who's an insider and who's an outsider. And so it seems to make more sense as a book written during that time period, even though it sets itself during the time of the judges. And it sets itself up to say something really profound about David. Kind of with me?
Yeah.
Okay. So let me play with that for just one more minute. If it were written during this time period, which I'm arguing it's not, then you would read it as a kind of factual account. If it's written down here, then you have to wonder, what else is it doing, other than just telling us what really happened? Right? What else is going? I don't just go around telling stories about the Revolutionary War today. I don't just go around saying, hey, did you know about George Washington? That's interesting. When I bring up George Washington, I bring it up for a reason. When our Congress people bring up Washington, they bring it up for a reason today, not because they're interested in ancient or early American history, right? It's being used in some kind of way. So when Ruth is written, whoever wrote Ruth, in this post-exilic period, and it's trying to say a Moabite woman was the great-great-grandmother of David, it's trying to make some kind of theological statement about how the Moabites and outsiders must also be a part of God's plan. There's a theological kind of undercurrent there. And so it weaves this story about David. It connects it back to David. Right? So when it was written will change a little bit how we think about why it was written. So we can think about the American Constitution and we can say, let's try to figure out what it meant when it was written by the framers. And then we can also ask the question, which is a separate question, what does it mean for us today? And those might be related, right? In fact, some judicial theories, some of our justices in the Supreme Court think those are really related, right? Like, if you can decide what it really meant back then, that's exactly what it means today. But others go, well, yeah, but there wasn't this topic back then, right? Like, I don't know, electricity, airplanes, right? Airplanes didn't exist or something, right? So we got to reinterpret it. So what happens is, in each new era, right, these communities are taking these texts and reimagining them, reinterpreting them for their new situation, which is what we're doing today, right? In 2022, is we're taking this text up every week and we're saying, what does this mean for my congregation? What does this mean for my faith community, right? And that's connected to what it meant back then, but it's also hopefully connected to something that's going on today. Otherwise, you're just talking about the past. Otherwise, it's just a history lesson. And maybe you've heard sermons that are history lessons, right? Versus sermons that are actually talking about something that's going on today, right? So that's the kind of distinction that is often made that gets a little confusing, is when people start talking about these books that we think are that happened a really long time ago, is actually being written later than that, later on down the road. So we have here in front of us these posters of kind of the narrative, if you will. One way to think about it is a kind of historical approach versus a kind of literary approach. I don't know if that's helpful. Kind of put on your historian cap, and that's when was this text written? Versus putting on your kind of like English major or like novel reading hat, and you just want to read the story. So you can pick up, Shakespeare or J.K. Rowling or whoever, and you can just read the story and enjoy the story. It doesn't matter when it was written. Or you can say, when was this written? And does that affect the reason why they wrote it this way? Do you see how those are two different ways of approaching the text? One interested in history, one interested in kind of narrative, literary. Right? Okay, so that's one of those distinctions that I think sometimes kind of trips people up. We'll get into it a little bit tomorrow, but I think there's also other more interesting questions, frankly. I mean, I don't want to get stuck in the kind of, did this really happen, or when did this really happen, so much as I'm interested in how is God moving in the lives of these people, and how does God continue to move in our lives today. So I'm interested in that story, right, that continues on down to us, right, today. Okay, I think that's enough for